On the side of a desolate highway in the bitter cold of the northern wilderness, two tiny grizzly bear cubs were left to die. No food, no shelter, just a ditch and a road full of speeding cars. They were too young to defend themselves, too scared to cry out. And the man who abandoned them? He thought no one would ever find them. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching. A stranger, an ordinary man with a broken past, would make an extraordinary choice that would change everything. This is a story of betrayal, survival, and an act of compassion that will leave you breathless. What happens next will stay with you forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories like this one. The cold wind blew harsh across the long, empty stretch of highway in northern Montana. The air was dry, the ground frozen. On most days, no one would have noticed anything unusual, just another lonely road cutting through the wilderness. But today, something was wrong. Down in a shallow ditch on the side of the highway, two small shapes huddled together, barely moving. Their brown fur was matted with mud and ice, their bodies trembling. Grizzly bear cubs, no more than a few months old, alone, afraid, abandoned. They had been left there hours earlier, dumped like trash by a man whose only thought was to get rid of them. Maybe he had raised them illegally. Maybe he thought they were too much trouble. No one knew. No one saw him drive off. But he was wrong about one thing. Someone had seen him. Farther up the road, Ben Holloway, a 58-year-old retired mechanic, was sitting in his old truck. He had pulled over to rest his eyes after a long morning helping a neighbor with their generator. Life had been quiet for Ben since his wife passed, just him, his dog Cody, and long drives through the countryside. He hadn't been asleep long when he heard it, a vehicle screeching to a stop, a door slamming, and then silence. He opened his eyes just in time to catch a dark SUV speeding away. Strange, he thought. Why stop way out here? Curiosity got the better of him. He started the engine, pulled slowly onto the shoulder, and got out to take a look. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought they were dogs. But as he stepped closer, the reality hit him like a punch to the chest. Two tiny grizzly cubs, barely breathing, curled against each other in the snow. Ben froze. He had lived in Montana his whole life. He knew what grizzlies could do. But these weren't threats. These were babies, terrified, starving, and clinging to life. His instincts screamed at him to call for help. But something deeper pulled at him, a voice he hadn't heard in years. His wife's voice, soft and steady. Do what's right, not what's easy. And in that moment, Ben knew. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Chapter 2, A Choice in the Snow. Ben knelt in the snow, staring at the cubs. His breath came out in shaky clouds as the cold sank deeper into his bones. The cubs didn't react to his presence. They didn't growl. They didn't try to run. They were too weak to care. One of them had a bleeding paw, cut most likely on the sharp gravel near the road. The other had snow stuck to its face, its eyes barely open. Both were fading fast. Ben's hands hovered just above them, unsure of what to do. He looked around, expecting to see the mother bear nearby. But the woods were still. Too still. He knew what that meant. They had been truly abandoned. His thoughts raced. Should he call Fish and Wildlife? Animal control? What if they didn't come in time? What if they saw the cubs as a danger and decided to put them down? No. He couldn't risk that. He had to move. Now. Ben stood up and jogged back to his truck. His old dog, Cody, raised his head from the passenger seat, his ears perked in quiet curiosity. "Easy, boy," Ben murmured, pulling out an emergency blanket and a half-empty thermos of coffee. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Back at the ditch, Ben wrapped the blanket around the cubs as gently as he could. They barely stirred. He poured a bit of lukewarm coffee onto a lid and held it close to their noses. The stronger cub licked it once. The other didn't move at all. His throat tightened. "This is crazy," he whispered. "I'm no vet. I'm not even supposed to touch wild animals." But something inside him wouldn't let go. Something that had been dormant for a long time. Since his wife, Elaine, passed. She had always been the one to care. She volunteered at the shelter, rescued injured animals, left food out for stray cats, even during snowstorms. He'd always teased her for it, called her heart too big for this world. But right now, her voice was louder than the wind in his ears. "Do what's right, not what's easy." Ben picked up both cubs, gently, awkwardly, cradling their weight like precious cargo, and laid them in the back of his truck. Cody sniffed them once, then curled up quietly beside them, as if he understood. Ben started the engine. The heater groaned to life. He pulled away from the shoulder, merging back onto the empty road, eyes fixed ahead, but his mind 1,000 miles away. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get them warm. He had to keep them alive just long enough to figure out the rest, just long enough to give them a chance. The drive felt endless. Ben's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes flicking between the snow-covered road and the rear-view mirror. In the back, wrapped in the emergency blanket, the two bear cubs barely moved. His dog, Cody, lay curled beside them, occasionally lifting his head to check on them before resting it gently again. The heater was on full blast, but the chill in Ben's chest had nothing to do with the weather. He had no plan. All he knew was that they couldn't stay in the truck for long, not in this cold, not in this condition. Ben's mind raced. The nearest ranger station was over 40 miles away, and if he brought the cubs there, what would happen? Would they be taken in or euthanized for being too weak to rehabilitate? No, he wouldn't risk it, not until he gave them a real chance. He turned down a narrow, unplowed service road hidden behind a row of pines. It led to a place he hadn't visited in almost 2 years, his late father's old hunting cabin. It wasn't much, just a one-room shelter with a fireplace, a cot, and a few dusty supplies. But it was warm, isolated, quiet. And it might just save their lives. 20 minutes later, the truck rolled to a stop in front of the cabin. The snow was thick, and the wind howled between the trees. Ben stepped out and opened the back door gently. The stronger cub blinked, weak but aware. The other was still limp. His heart sank. He lifted them both, one at a time, into his arms. They were heavier than he remembered, but he carried them with the gentleness of a man cradling newborns. Cody followed silently behind. Inside, the cabin was cold and still, but intact. Ben laid the cubs on a bed of old towels near the fireplace, then got to work. He chopped firewood, just like his father had taught him, and built a fire, slowly feeding it until a faint orange glow lit the room. The warmth spread gradually. Cody curled near the fire, offering his own body heat to the cubs. Ben heated a pot of water and stirred in what little honey and milk powder he had found in the cupboard. He didn't know what cubs this young needed, but anything was better than nothing. He dipped a clean rag into the mixture and gently touched it to the stronger cub's mouth. It licked, swallowed, then licked again. Hope. He turned to the other one, the weaker of the two. Its breathing was shallow, eyes closed tight. Ben's throat tightened. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "You're not done yet." The cub didn't respond, but Ben didn't stop. For hours, he stayed by their side, feeding, watching, warming the room and their tiny bodies, whispering words he hadn't said out loud in years. He told them about Elaine. He told them about the cabin. He told them he wouldn't leave them, not now, not ever. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. The fire had burned low overnight, but the air inside was still warmer than the bitter cold outside. Ben stirred in the old armchair, his neck stiff, his back aching from sleeping upright. His first thought wasn't of himself, it was of them. He sat up quickly and turned to the cubs. One of them, the stronger one, was curled up beside Cody, eyes closed but breathing steadily. The other, Ben's breath caught, it was awake. Still weak, but blinking, shifting slightly. Ben dropped to his knees. "Hey there, little one," he whispered, barely daring to believe it. "You're still with me." He reached for the pot and warmed a bit more milk and honey, then gently fed both cubs again. This time, they both responded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A tear slipped down Ben's face. He hadn't cried since Elaine died, not once. But something about watching life cling so fiercely to the edge of survival, it cracked something open inside him. But just as hope began to grow, a new sound pierced the quiet. Tires. Ben froze. The cabin was miles off the main road, and no one had any reason to come this far, not in winter. He rushed to the window and peeked out. A white pickup truck had pulled halfway into the clearing. Two men stepped out, both wearing hunter's camo. One of them held a rifle. Ben's stomach dropped. Poachers. Or worse, someone looking for the cubs. He moved quickly, stepping between the fire and the cubs, lowering the flame so the light wouldn't be so visible. Cody growled, low and steady, beside him. Ben opened the door slightly and stepped outside. "Morning," one of the men called, forcing a smile. "Didn't think anyone was up here this time of year." Ben nodded, his voice steady. "Just keeping the place from falling apart." The man's eyes narrowed. "You up here alone?" Ben nodded again. They looked past him toward the cabin. "Funny," the second man muttered. "We heard a call on the radio. Someone saw bear cubs left near the highway. Looked like someone picked them up." Ben's heart thundered in his chest. "I wouldn't know anything about that," he said flatly. The man with the rifle stepped forward, casually scanning the tree line. "Mind if we look around?" Ben took a slow breath. "Yeah. I do." The air between them thickened for a moment. No one spoke. Then Cody stepped out beside Ben, stiff-legged, growling low and deep. Ben didn't flinch. After a few seconds, the men exchanged a look. "We'll be on our way," the man said finally, giving a short nod. "Keep warm." They got back in their truck and drove off. Ben didn't move until the sound of the engine disappeared completely into the trees. Only then did he step back inside, close the door, and kneel down by the cubs again. He had just lied to armed men to protect two wild animals, and he would do it again. It had been 4 days since Ben found the cubs. In that short time, the old cabin had turned into a kind of sanctuary. The fire never went out. The cubs had begun to respond, eating more, moving a little, their eyes clearer, more alert. Cody had become their silent guardian, never leaving their side. But Ben was running on fumes. His hands were raw from chopping wood. He was almost out of milk powder and honey. The storm forecasted earlier in the week was now a reality. Thick snow pounded the forest, burying the truck and cutting off the narrow service road completely. He was stuck, and he was running out of time. That morning, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled low, Ben sat beside the cubs, staring into the flames. He was afraid. Not of the bears. Not of the storm. But of what came next. He had grown attached, more than he meant to, more than he should have. When he looked at them, he didn't see wild animals anymore. He saw something else, a second chance. A second chance to do good. A second chance to be needed. But deep down, Ben knew the truth. They didn't belong here, not forever. They were growing stronger, yes, but they were still wild animals. They needed space, safety, a future. And he couldn't give that to them. He had to make a decision. Ben stood, walked to the table, and picked up the radio. It had barely worked since the storm began, but it still crackled now and then. His fingers hovered over the button that would send a distress signal to wildlife authorities. He didn't press it. Instead, he stared at the cubs, one of them sleeping soundly, the other chewing curiously on an old bootlace. They were alive because of him, and letting them go might mean never seeing them again. Suddenly, Cody growled, a low, sharp sound. Ben turned, startled. Outside the cabin, through the frost-covered window, he saw it. A shadow. Not a human. A bear. An adult grizzly. Ben's blood turned to ice. Could it be the mother? He moved to the window slowly. The figure was pacing near the tree-lean, massive, cautious, powerful. She didn't approach the cabin, but her head turned toward it, her nose lifted. She was sniffing, listening. She knew. She knew her cubs were inside. Ben's chest tightened. What was he supposed to do? Would she attack? Would she wait? Would she leave? He looked back at the cubs, and in that moment, he understood. They didn't just need him anymore. She needed them too. But if he opened that door, he could be walking into a moment that would break him completely, a moment where doing the right thing would mean letting go. Ben stood by the door, frozen. Outside, the storm had calmed just enough for him to see the outline of the massive grizzly moving through the trees. She didn't growl. Didn't charge. She simply paced, stopping now and then to sniff the air, then looking directly at the cabin as if she knew. She did know. Ben had never felt more torn in his life. He looked over his shoulder at the cubs. One of them was sleeping again. The other was chewing slowly on an old towel, blinking at Ben with curious eyes, so full of trust it nearly undid him. They had stopped fearing him. They had let him in. And now? Now he had to let them go. His hand reached slowly for the door latch. His heart hammered in his chest. Was this suicide? Was he about to open the door to a wild bear and hope for the best? Everything he knew about grizzlies screamed, no. But something deeper, something ancient, instinctual, human whispered, yes. Ben turned the latch and slowly opened the door. The icy air rushed in. Across the clearing, the mother bear froze. Their eyes met, man and beast, protector and mother, both broken and afraid, both doing the only thing they knew, fighting for those who depended on them. Ben stepped aside. He said nothing, made no movement. He simply opened the space, a silent invitation or a final surrender. And then she moved. Not quickly, not recklessly, but slowly, deliberately. She crossed the clearing with powerful, quiet steps, her breath misting in the cold. When she reached the threshold of the cabin, she stopped. Her nose lifted. She sniffed the air, the fire, the man. And then she looked past him. The cubs had noticed her now. The stronger one stood up, wobbling on its paws. It let out a soft, broken sound, not a roar, not a growl. A cry. A call. The mother responded with a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound no human could ever replicate. The sound of recognition. The sound of home. Ben stepped back. The bear entered the cabin. She didn't look at him again. Her focus was on her cubs, sniffing them, checking them, gently nudging them with her massive nose. One licked her muzzle. The other climbed halfway onto her front paw and collapsed into her warmth. It was over. She had come for them. She had found them. Ben wiped his face. He hadn't realized he was crying. He stepped back outside into the snow, the door still open behind him. He didn't know how long they would stay, minutes, hours, maybe until dawn. But it didn't matter. He had done his part. He had kept them alive. And now the rest was up to her. The sun rose slowly over the pines, casting long golden beams across the snow. The wind had finally calmed, and the forest stood in stillness as if watching. Ben stood just outside the cabin, arms crossed, his breath fogging in the morning air. His back ached, and his fingers were numb, but he couldn't bring himself to go back inside. Not yet. He had heard nothing for hours. Not a growl. Not a movement. Just the fire crackling inside and the occasional soft huff of the bear cubs in their mother's warmth. And then she emerged. The grizzly mother stepped out of the cabin, her body towering in the doorway. She paused, her breath heavy, her eyes meeting Ben's for a brief moment, not as a threat, not as a beast, but as a mother. A being who had come to reclaim what she thought was lost. Ben didn't move. He didn't need to. She knew. She knew who had kept them alive. Behind her, the two cubs stumbled out, clumsy in the snow, sticking close to her legs. One looked back at Ben just for a second before nudging against its sibling and following their mother into the trees. They didn't rush. They didn't run. They simply walked. Together. Ben watched until the last flick of her tail disappeared into the pines. And then they were gone. Gone like a dream that lingers just long enough to remind you it was real. He stepped back into the cabin slowly. The space felt emptier now, not just because the cubs were gone, but because something had left with them. He stood in silence, staring at the blankets, the feeding bowl, the fire still glowing low. Cody sat at his feet, ears slightly drooped, as if he too understood what had just happened. Ben dropped to one knee and ran a hand through the dog's fur. "We did good, boy," he whispered. "We did real good." He didn't cry this time. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it meant something. For the first time since Elaine's death, Ben felt like he'd been a part of something bigger than himself. Something that mattered. Something real. Outside, the sun rose higher, catching the glint of the trees, warming the air just a little. Ben looked out into the forest one last time and smiled. Sometimes the right thing isn't easy. It isn't comfortable. And it isn't safe. But it matters. This story wasn't just about survival. It was about compassion, courage, and the unspoken bond between two worlds. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who still believes in doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Because kindness leaves tracks that never fade.